She had perhaps inherited this from her uncle, Dr. Theophilus Lee, the master of Balliol College, Oxford, whose bon mots were famous. Mrs. Austen's early married life was domestic to the exclusion of every other interest. She bore 4 sons in little more than 4 years, and when she was not tied to her own house, on one occasion at least, she went to London to nurse a sister-in-law in her confinement. The lady whom she nursed in town was Mrs. Walter, the wife of George Austen's half-brother. Mrs. Austen much preferred her own country existence, and said of her stay in London, "'Tis a sad place. I would not live in it on any account. One has not time to do one's duty either to God or man." Of Mrs. Austen's first 4 children, the second, George, was subject to fits, and was never able to live with the family. He died in 1827. The 3 other little boys, James, Edward, and Henry, were healthy and high-spirited. Then a daughter was born, called Cassandra after her mother. Like her brothers, she was put out to nurse for the first 4 months, and when she was brought home, Mrs. Austen wrote and begged Mr. and Mrs. Walter to pay a visit, saying, "I want to show you my Henry and my Cassie, who are both reckoned very fine children." Presently she wrote, "My little girl is almost ready to run away." The child had an aquiline nose, and her eyes were black. Mrs. Austen did not say that she was pretty, but when the baby was 2, she wrote to Mrs. Walter, "My little girl talks all day long, and in my opinion is a very entertaining companion." By this time there was another boy, Francis, also doing well. As his mother said, "My last boy is very stout." And again their friends in London were expecting to hear of a confinement, until on December 17, 1775, Mr. Austen wrote to Mrs. Walter, "Dear sister, you have doubtless been for some time in expectation of hearing from Hampshire, and perhaps wondered a little we were, in our old age, grown such bad reckoners. But so it was, for Cassie is certainly expected to have been brought to a bed a month ago. However, last night the time came, and without a great deal of warning everything was soon happily over. We now have another girl, a present plaything for her sister Cassie, and a future companion. She is to be Jenny, and seems to me as if she would be as like Harry as Cassie is to Neddy. Your sister, thank God, is pure well after it." Among so many brothers, it must have been a delight to little Cassandra to have a sister to look after and to play with, and with a good share of her father's affectionate nature and her mother's practical good sense, she soon became, young as she was, the most important figure in her little sister's world. Mrs. Austen had her last child soon after, a 6th son, christened Charles, and with a new baby and a large family, she was only too glad that Cassandra took upon herself so much of the care of Jane. The younger child repaid her sister's affection 100-fold, and Mrs. Austen said that if Cassandra were to have her head cut off, she believed Jane would insist on having hers cut off too. James and Henry had a strong academic bent, but all the boys were eager sportsmen. From their earliest years they hunted and shot. For the 2 little girls who could not hunt and shoot, the range of interests was smaller. They did not ride, as they might have done. Mrs. Austen had been a horsewoman, and in her trousseau there had been a scarlet riding habit, though this had long been cut up into coats and trousers for the boys when very little. But there were amusements to get the girls out of doors. When the weather was good, the walks about Steventon were very beautiful. The lanes were full of primroses and violets in the spring, and the neighbourhood had the beauty of Hampshire woodland. Jane said many years afterwards that she thought beauty of landscape must be one of the joys of heaven. There was a home farm also, where Mrs. Austen's dairy was supplied by 5 Alderney cows. When Cassandra was about 10 and Jane 7 years old, the Reverend George Austen seems to have felt that for his daughters at least, his own teaching was not sufficient. Mrs. Austen's sister, the beautiful Jane, had married Dr. Cooper, a clergyman living near Bath, and Dr. Cooper had a sister, Mrs. Corley, who, the widow of a master of Brasenose, undertook the care of a few children at her house in Oxford. Jane was thought to be too young to benefit very much from any educational advantages Mrs. Corley might bestow, but it was already taken for granted by the family that where Cassandra went, there, if humanly possible, she must go also. With them went their cousin, Jane Cooper. Perhaps the three of them together were happy enough, but Mrs. Corley was somewhat unsympathetic and very formal in her manners, and coming from such a home as Steventon, Cassandra and Jane felt the change very much. One may imagine Jane, a small, slender child with a round face and big black eyes, following Cassandra like a shadow, shy but ready at once to be friendly and merry with anyone who was kind. After a while Mrs. Corley moved to Southampton, and was allowed to take the children with her. Here, however, Cassandra and Jane fell ill of what was called at the time a putrid fever, which was perhaps diphtheria. Jane Cooper longed for her mother and aunt, but Mrs. Corley would not allow her to write to them. At last, however, her cousin Jane became so very ill that the homesick, frightened child could bear it no longer, and wrote to her mother, who, with Mrs. Austen, came down to Southampton immediately. Jane nearly died. She recovered with her mother's nursing, but Mrs. Cooper, who took her daughter away and went back to Bath with her, had caught the infection, and shortly after died herself. This severe early illness does not seem to have made the Austens unduly anxious about their younger daughter, and quite soon another boarding-school experiment was tried, this time with much more success. The Abbey School at Reading, where Jane and Cassandra were sent, was kept by an elderly lady called Mrs. Latournelle. She was far removed from the severity of Mrs. Corley. Her cap and neckerchief were always starched and spotless, and her parlour was hung round with pictures of urns and weeping willows embroidered in chenille, but she was at the same time stout and very active, although she had an artificial leg, and her conversation was never so fluent as upon the topic of plays and play-acting, green-room anecdotes, and the private lives of actors. The school buildings were romantic, formed in part as they were of the old gatehouse of the Abbey, and surrounded by a spacious, shady garden, very delightful to the girls in hot summer evenings. The Austens' stay, however, was not a lengthy one. When Jane was 9, they returned home, and from that time they never left it. There can be no doubt that Jane Austen's real education was gained in the years between 9 and 16, which she spent under her father's care. Whether she joined her brother's lessons in the rector's study, or whether Mr. Austen gave her what time he could spare apart from them, we do not know. His attention was not now so fully occupied by his sons. James, who was 12 years older than Jane, had already obtained an Oxford degree and was a Fellow of St. John's. He was the least lively of the family, with a thin face and dark, melancholy eyes. The second brother, Edward, had been removed from the family circle by what was, from a worldly point of view, a stroke of fantastic good fortune. A distant connection of Mr. Austen's, Mr. Thomas Knight of Chawton House in Hampshire and Godmersham Park in Kent, had no children of his own. His family had always been kindly disposed to the Austens, and he and his wife had taken a great fancy to Edward, and often had him for visits at Chawton or Godmersham, so much so that Mr. Austen began at last to protest, and say Edward was getting too far behind with his Latin grammar. But Mrs. Austen said, "I think, my dear, you had better oblige your cousins and let the child go." And in due course Mr. Knight adopted Edward, and made him heir to his property. The impression given by Edward's portrait is not that of a clever man, but of an eminently sound and capable one. Mr. and Mrs. Knight chose the one among the Austen boys most suited to the career of a country gentleman. They brought him up with that end perpetually in view, and instead of putting him to the university, as his father would probably have done, they sent him to make the grand tour. Thus he was abroad when his sisters came home from Reading. Widely different from James or Edward was the eldest brother now living at home, Henry, the handsomest, most fascinating, least stable of all the family. Henry inherited his father's bright hazel eyes, and the gaiety and good humour which were family characteristics were concentrated in him with an effect of positive brilliance. He was not profound, but he learned so readily, and executed everything he did with such elegance and dash, that his father's affection for him somewhat overpowered his judgment, and he